Welcome to the 8th edition of World Intellectual Property Forum. The inaugural ceremony will be starting in few minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to participate in the World Intellectual Property Forum, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share some views. Today, I thought I would speak on a topic which is rather current and a bit interesting, given that the world is facing a situation similar to one a few decades back, but has reacted very differently this time. Though I do hasten to add that the earlier situation was not as serious as this one. If there is one issue which is keeping the planet totally engaged today, it is the COVID pandemic. And that is certainly not surprising given the magnitude of the problem. For instance, by end November, there were 60 million cases all over the globe, with 1.5 million dead. In the Hong Kong flu about 50 years back, about 1 million people had died and 32 million through AIDS in the last 40 years. Neither of these was as serious as this one, given the short period in which we've had such fatalities. All nations are battling the challenge through various measures, which in turn has wreaked havoc with the world economy, pushing the vulnerable sections of the population into poverty. Scientists and the finest minds in the world are working on a vaccine to meet this challenge. Earlier, it would take about 10 to 20 years to develop and test vaccines, but now we've had several cases in less than a year, cases of development of vaccines. There's something like 164 COVID-19 vaccines in preclinical evaluation and 48 in clinical evaluation, of which 11 are undergoing phase 3 efficacy testing. The BioNTech Pfizer vaccine and Moderna have already reported about 95% success in phase 3 efficacy trials. Russia's Sputnik 5 vaccine has also claimed 92% interim efficacy. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine interim phase 3 results show 90% efficacy. Back home in India, we are currently testing 3 vaccine candidates: Covaxin from a partnership between the ICMR and Bharat Biotech, a DNA vaccine called ZyCoV-CoV-D, and of course, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine manufactured in India by the Pune-based Serum Institute. But what is most surprising this time is that there is no significant talk, no debate about patent protection, apart from a few issues that I will discuss at the end. And why I say not much of a debate, because 25 years back, the world had reacted very differently. The WTO agreement had just been concluded and TRIPS had become a reality. The developed world was aggressively asserting its rights on patent protection through various bilateral and multilateral routes. India, in 1996, faced 2 disputes at the WTO as we had defaulted on some TRIPS obligations. We lost both and had to amend our laws. A very, very excruciating process through our parliament at that time. But the case which grabbed the world attention at that time was in South Africa, and I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about it. In 1998, 39 pharmaceutical manufacturers sued the government to prevent the implementation of a law which had been designed to facilitate access to AIDS drugs at a low cost. The companies, most of them in Europe and the United States, accused South Africa, which at that time had the largest population of individuals living with HIV/AIDS in the world, of circumventing patent protection guaranteed by TRIPS. The act, which had been passed by President Nelson Mandela to promote affordable medicines by inserting 4 provisions. Number 1, using parallel importation. Number 2, authorizing imports of generic versions through compulsory licenses. Number 3, ensuring distribution of generic copies. And number 4, establishing a committee to control prices. Now, at that time, the per capita income of a South African was $2,600, whereas the cost of AIDS treatment through that vaccine was about $1,000 a month. While AIDS activists called for international protests against drug profiteering, the companies defended the court action on the ground that parallel importation of drugs would undermine their ability to charge different prices in different parts of the world. PhRMA, which is the American Pharmaceutical Researchers and Manufacturers Association, convinced the US government to put pressure on South Africa. Subsequently, South Africa was put on the Special 301 watch list, both in 1998 and 1999, and the GSP benefits were withdrawn. There was an uproar in the global media, and a whole lot of activists stepped in to defend South Africa. At that time, Al Gore, who was the vice president, was contesting the election, and he became a target of the activists. The AIDS activists, realizing that the 2000 presidential campaign had made Gore particularly vulnerable to negative publicity, disrupted a number of his campaign events, ultimately forcing the US government to change its stance. After a series of negotiations, in September 1999, the USTR and South African government announced a patch-up under which A, the US government would no longer pressure South Africa, and B, South Africa promised to adhere to its obligations under TRIPS. In 2001, the pharma companies dropped their lawsuit, but the pressure was sustained. When the WTO Ministerial Conference was held in Doha, Qatar in December 2001, the African group put the issue on the agenda of the conference. After protracted negotiations, at the end of the conference, the WTO member states adopted the Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health. The declaration affirmed under the TRIPS agreement a member state's right to grant compulsory licenses and determine the grounds for the same. B, the right to determine what constitutes a national emergency. C, it was free to establish its own patent exhaustion regime. And it also recognized that the WTO members with insufficient or no manufacturing capacities in the pharmaceutical sector could face difficulties in making effective use of compulsory licensing under TRIPS. This ultimately led to the adoption of the Para 6 Amendment at the WTO, which ensured that the country without manufacturing facilities could import a patented drug from another country under reciprocal compulsory licensing regimes. There were 3 main factors for the success at that time. A, the developing countries were united. B, the traditional views adopted by the United States and Western countries had become difficult to maintain, particularly after the 9/11 incident in New York and the anthrax scare, after which both Canada and the United States declared that they would have no hesitation in using compulsory licensing in order to deal with the scarcity of Cipro. And third, of course, a large number of AIDS activists and non-governmental organizations made sure that the issue received a great deal of publicity. Now, in the next few years after that, 6 or 7 years after that, there were several other developments all over the world, all pointing in the same direction. The UK Commission on Intellectual Property Rights in 2002, the UNCTAD 11 in 2004, and the Second South Summit at Doha in 2005 all reaffirmed the rights of developing countries to protect public health when it came to intellectual property. And very surprisingly, the Government Accountability Office of the US Congress in 2007 and the OECD in the same year struck the same chord, saying that while it is important to protect the rights of patentees, it was also important to uphold public interest, and pressure should not be put on developing countries to simply pay heed to the former. Now, all this ultimately led to the WIPO development agenda process at the World Intellectual Property Organization between 2004 and 2007, the agenda finally being adopted by the General Assembly of the WIPO in September 2007. Now, what did the agenda say? It said that IP was not an end in itself, but a means for protecting public interest, innovation, and access to science and technology. B, that the credibility undermined by promoting benefits of protection without acknowledging public policy concerns, putting emphasis on one part and ignoring the other. And lastly, integrating the development dimension into all aspects of intellectual property will strengthen the credibility and encourage its acceptance as a tool for innovation, creativity, and development. Now, what was the effect thereafter? The most important thing was that the developed world stopped putting pressure on developing countries. And after 2001, there were hardly any disputes initiated by the developed world on developing countries at the WTO in the area of patent protection. Before that, between 1996 and 2001, out of 24 disputes at the WTO in the area of intellectual property, 16 were filed by developed countries, against developing countries. The tagline on intellectual property is now striking a balance between protecting rights and upholding public interest. Now, what has been happening in the last few months when it comes to the COVID vaccine? In May, the WHO officially launched the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, which is a patent pooling initiative originally proposed by Costa Rica. Under this, there'll be encouragement for the licensing of vaccines to the United Nations Medicines Patent Pool and promote open innovation models through tech transfer supported by 36 countries. In June, the WHO gave a solidarity call to action to realize equitable access to COVID-19 health technologies through pooling of knowledge, intellectual property, and data. WHO's efforts to promote global public health goods based on equity, strong science, open collaboration, and global solidarity. Later, in October, at the World Trade Organization, India and South Africa sought a waiver on certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement to speed up efforts to prevent, treat, and contain the pandemic. The same issues have been raised over here also. A, IPRs hinder timely provisioning of affordable medicines. B, there is concern for countries with insufficient or no manufacturing capacity. And C, difficulties using the flexibilities available in the TRIPS agreement. Now, to start with, it has been opposed by the developed countries, and a final decision is expected in the meeting of the WTO General Council later in December this year. But one does not expect any major resistance, as the world is now more sensitive to such issues, and though it is imperative to provide recompense to private companies which sink millions into research. It's fairly clear that when a company invests large sums of money into developing a vaccine particularly when they're operating at the frontiers of technology, some mechanism has to be developed to provide them some kind of compensation for the investments that they have made. Of course, it is not possible to recover those investments by imposing a market price on these vaccines, because most vulnerable sections in developing countries would not be able to afford the drug. But then again, it's incumbent on national states and international organizations to ensure that some kind of subsidy arrangements are worked out to ensure that there's equitable administration of the vaccine all over the world. It's not just the availability of the vaccine which is important. What is also important is the delivery mechanism, so that the vaccine is also administered to the population in the way in which it is intended. So thank you very much for your patience. I'd like to thank the organizers again for giving me an opportunity to share some of my views, and I'll be happy to take questions if any. Thank you.